By accident, you've just traveled 50,000 years into the past. You are in Australia's forest in the dead of night. You're already scared to death when suddenly you hear something in the distance. A Diprotodon moves slowly through the dark. It is the largest marsupial that has ever lived. A wombat grown to the dimensions of a rhinoceros, weighing more than 2 tons, and it browses without urgency, untroubled, because almost nothing on the entire continent is large enough or bold enough to threaten a full-grown adult of its kind. Almost nothing. Somewhere above it, folded into the branches of a tree, something is waiting. It is patient, it is silent, and it has been watching for a long time. And when it finally drops, the 2.5-ton giant will be dead within a minute, its throat opened by a single deliberate cut. The animal that killed it was not a big cat. Australia never had big cats. It was not a wolf, it was not a bear, and it was not anything armed with the long, stabbing canines we instinctively associate with a killer. In almost every way, by every expectation you carry about what an apex predator is supposed to be, this animal was wrong. Because it was a marsupial, a close relative of the wombat and the koala, animals we think of as gentle, slow, and harmless. And yet, pound for pound, relative to its body size, it possessed the most powerful bite ever measured in any mammal that has ever lived. Its name was Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion. And for 2 million years, it was the most dangerous creature on the Australian continent. This is the story of how an animal descended from herbivores became the most terrifying marsupial that ever lived, and of how recently and how completely it vanished. Let's begin with what it actually was, because the name marsupial lion is misleading in both halves. It was not a lion, and it was not closely related to one. The resemblance is a coincidence, the same kind of coincidence that gave Australia a marsupial that looked like a wolf. Thylacoleo belonged to an order of marsupials called the Diprotodontia, the same broad group that contains wombats, koalas, kangaroos, and possums, a lineage whose members are, almost without exception, dedicated plant eaters. Somewhere along that overwhelmingly vegetarian branch of the family tree, one line turned to flesh. By the late Pleistocene, more than 2 million years ago, that line had produced Thylacoleo, and it would stalk the forests and woodlands of Australia until the late Pleistocene. In life, it was roughly the size of a leopard or a small jaguar. It stood around 75 centimeters at the shoulder, measured about 1.5 meters from nose to tail, and weighed somewhere between 100 and 130 kilograms. It had a compact, muscular body, short and powerful limbs, and a thick, heavy tail that, like a kangaroo's, may have braced it as it reared up on its hind legs. The females carried their young in a pouch. It hunted at night, it could climb, and it killed from ambush. And it lived in the very landscapes that still exist in Australia today, which is part of what makes its story so unsettling. But to understand why it was so formidable, you have to look at 3 features it possessed, each one stranger than the last, and none of which has ever been found together in any other predator, living or extinct. The first is its bite. In the early 2000s, the paleontologist Stephen Rowe and his colleagues at the University of New South Wales set out to measure and compare the bite forces of predatory mammals, modeling the skulls of living and extinct hunters and calculating how hard each one could actually clamp down. They were looking for the relationship between an animal's size and the power of its jaws. And when they placed Thylacoleo into that comparison, it broke the pattern completely. Relative to its body mass, the marsupial lion bit down harder than any other mammalian predator they examined, living or extinct, harder proportionally than the African lion, the tiger, the wolf, or the hyena. The numbers are worth stating carefully, because the detail is everything. In absolute terms, a crocodile or a tyrannosaurus bit down with more total force. But for its size, nothing came close. A Thylacoleo weighing around 100 kilograms delivered a bite comparable to that of an African lion, weighing 2.5 times as much. Imagine the full crushing power of a 250-kilogram lion's jaws packed into the body of an animal less than half that weight, and you begin to understand the kind of machine this was. The reason lay in its skull, which was short, deep, and almost grotesquely compact, with enormous jaw muscles anchored to a tall ridge of bone running along the top of the head. Everything about that architecture was built to do one thing: to concentrate an extraordinary amount of force into a very small space. One bite, that's all it took. This was not a skull designed for grabbing, or wrestling, or holding on. It was a skull designed to close once, with overwhelming power, and to end the fight in that single motion. To put it in human terms, it was as if nature had taken the jaw muscles of a far larger beast and bolted them onto a compact, leopard-sized frame, then stripped away everything that did not serve the killing blow. What it surrendered in range and versatility, it gained in raw closing force a bite so far out of proportion to its size that it never needed a second attempt. And yet, strangely, the bite was not even the most unusual thing about its mouth, because the second feature is the teeth, and the teeth should not exist. Almost every mammalian carnivore relies on its canines, the long, pointed teeth at the front of the jaw, to do the killing. Cats stab with them, dogs and wolves seize and tear with them. Thylacoleo had no significant canines at all. What it had instead was a set of weapons assembled from the wrong parts entirely. At the front of its mouth sat a pair of greatly enlarged incisors, almost rodent-like, sharpened to points and angled forward, which it used like daggers to stab and grip. And further back came the truly remarkable structures. A pair of enormous blade-like cheek teeth, carnassials, one on the upper jaw and one on the lower, on each side of the mouth elongated into curved cutting edges. When the jaws closed, these blades sheared past one another like the closing arms of a pair of bolt cutters, slicing cleanly through flesh, hide, and sinew. It was, in effect, a built-in pair of shears, driven by the most powerful bite for its size in mammalian history. Now consider where that equipment came from. Thylacoleo's ancestors were herbivores, plant grinders, animals with mouths built to process leaves and roots. Over time, that vegetarian lineage turned to meat and it faced a problem. It did not have the killing teeth a predator is supposed to have. So evolution did something rare and ingenious. Rather than grow new weapons, it repurposed the teeth the animal already possessed, reshaping a herbivore's dentition into a butcher's toolkit. It is one of the very few known cases in which a plant-eating mammalian lineage produced an apex predator, and it solved the puzzle by reinventing its own mouth from the inside out. It was precisely these strange teeth that made the animal so difficult for science to accept in the first place. When the great anatomist Richard Owen, the man who coined the word dinosaur, first described Thylacoleo from fragmentary remains in the 1850s, he had no doubt about what he was looking at, and he chose a name that left no room for argument: carnifex, the Latin word for an executioner, a butcher. But not everyone was convinced. For decades afterward, other naturalists pushed back, insisting that an animal sprung from a vegetarian family, an animal with no proper canines and a mouth unlike any living hunter's, could not possibly have been a flesh eater. Some suggested it had cracked open hard fruit or dug for roots and tubers. The dispute dragged on, unresolved, until the slow accumulation of evidence, the bite marks scored into the bones of giant prey, the shearing geometry of those blades, the sheer mechanical power locked in the jaw, finally settled it. Owen had been right from the beginning. The executioner was exactly what its name had always claimed. The third feature is the one that turns Thylacoleo from a powerful animal into a genuinely singular one, and it is found not in the head but in the hands. On each forelimb, Thylacoleo carried a thumb that was partly opposable, set apart from the other digits, and that thumb was tipped with a large, hooded, retractable claw, of the kind we associate with cats, not marsupials. No other marsupial, living or extinct, is known to have had anything like it. The implications are profound. It meant that this animal could grip its prey with a hold that no other mammalian predator could match. Not the cats, not the bears, not the wolves. Anchoring itself to a struggling body with hooked thumbs while its shearing teeth did their work. The structure of its limb bones suggests it was also a capable climber, with an arboreal ability comparable to that of a modern leopard, strong enough in all likelihood to haul prey up into the trees and to launch an attack from above. And when you combine all three of these features, a clearer and more chilling picture of how it hunted begins to emerge. The leading reconstruction goes something like this. Thylacoleo waited, hidden, often above its target. It dropped or lunged onto the prey, seized it with those clawed, opposable thumbs in a grip almost impossible to break, and then brought its jaws to the throat, where a single closure of those carnassial blades, backed by the strongest proportional bite of any mammal, could sever the windpipe and the major vessels of the neck in one motion. An animal caught this way would not endure a long, exhausting chase or a drawn-out struggle. It would simply be held, and then it would be gone, often in a matter of seconds. It is a strategy that prizes power and surprise over speed, the precise opposite of a pursuit hunter that runs its prey to exhaustion across open ground. Thylacoleo did not need to be fast. It needed only to be close, hidden, and certain, and to spend that single devastating bite well. For an ambush predator the size of a leopard, routinely taking down prey many times its own weight, that brutal economy of violence was not a flourish. It was the only way the arithmetic of such a hunt could ever balance. Few predators in the history of the planet have been built to kill so efficiently, which raises the obvious question: what does an animal like this hunt? And here the story expands from the merely impressive to the almost unbelievable, because Thylacoleo did not make its living on small game. It shared its world with the megafauna of Pleistocene Australia, a caste of giants that has no equivalent on the continent today, and it hunted them. There was the Diprotodon, the rhino-sized wombat relative we met at the very beginning, weighing well over 2 tons. And there is direct evidence, in the form of distinctive bite marks left on Diprotodon bones, that Thylacoleo fed on them. There was Procoptodon galea, a short-faced kangaroo that stood over 2 meters tall and weighed around 230 kilograms, a creature so large it could not hop the way modern kangaroos do. There was Zygomaturus, a smaller cousin of the Diprotodon, about the size of a bull. There was Ginornis, a flightless bird weighing as much as a grown man. And there was Megalania, a monitor lizard that may have reached well over 5 meters in length, which was less a meal than a rival, the two of them very likely competing for the same prey across the same ground. This was not a world of modest woodland animals. It was a continent of giants, a Pleistocene Australia populated by browsers the weight of cars and birds taller than a grown man, and Thylacoleo had evolved precisely to bring the largest of them down. The marks it left behind, preserved on fossilized bone, are not the tentative scrapes of a scavenger picking over a carcass. They are the signatures of a hunter that killed and butchered animals many times, its own size. Sit with the scale of that for a moment. The marsupial lion was very likely the only predator in all of Australia capable of bringing down a full-grown Diprotodon. Without it, the largest marsupial that ever lived would have had no serious natural enemy at all. For 2 million years, across an entire continent, Thylacoleo sat at the very top of the food chain, unchallenged, the single animal that the giants themselves had reason to fear. And then, in a span of time that is almost nothing at all, it was gone. So, what was the reason? A more dangerous and lethal predator took his throne, Humnus. The marsupial lion disappears from the fossil record somewhere between 40 and 46,000 years ago. The first humans reached Australia somewhere between 50 and 65,000 years ago. Those two windows overlap, and that overlap is not a coincidence anyone can comfortably ignore. Around the same period, the rest of the great megafauna, the Diprotodon, the giant kangaroos, the enormous flightless birds vanished as well, and the disappearance of the predator is bound tightly to the disappearance of its prey. There are 3 main explanations, and the truth is probably a combination of them. The first is direct hunting, that humans simply killed Thylacoleo, but this seems unlikely as a sole cause, because there is little archaeological evidence of marsupial lions being slaughtered in any quantity. The second is the collapse of its food supply. If human arrival drove the great herbivores toward extinction, through hunting, through fire, through the reshaping of the landscape, then a 100-kilogram predator built to kill 2-ton prey would have had nothing left large enough to sustain it. The third, and the explanation most researchers now favor, is a combination of a shifting, drying climate and the mounting pressure of a new and uniquely capable predator arriving on the continent for the first time. Whatever the exact mix, the outcome was the same. The apex of a continent, an animal that had reigned for 2 million years, was extinguished in a geological instant. And there is one more detail that closes the circle. In the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, there is rock art that some researchers believe depicts Thylacoleo, painted by the people who shared the land with it. If that identification holds, and the dating is confirmed, it would mean something extraordinary. That a human being once looked at a living marsupial lion and reached for pigment and drew it. Whoever made that painting was not illustrating a legend or a creature handed down through stories. They were recording an animal they had watched move through the landscape, an apex predator observed by human eyes and set down in pigment on stone, the way a modern naturalist might sketch a lion at a waterhole. For perhaps 10,000 years, 2 top predators shared this single continent, the oldest and the newest, the marsupial that had ruled for 2 million years, and the human who had only just arrived. Only one of them is still here, and that is the thought that gives this whole story its weight. We tend to file creatures like this away with the dinosaurs, in some safely distant past that has nothing to do with us. But Thylacoleo is not deep time. 40,000 years is almost nothing in evolutionary terms, the blink of an eye on the scale of life on Earth. This animal hunted in the same forests, crossed the same plains, and sheltered in the same caves that you can still walk into today, in places like the Narracoorte Caves of South Australia and the dry chambers beneath the Nullarbor Plain, where its skeletons have been found so complete that we can read its body almost like a living thing. It shared this continent with our own species for thousands of years, a vegetarian lineage that rebuilt its own teeth into shearing blades, that armed its hands with the only opposable killing claw in marsupial history, that delivered the most powerful bite for its size of any mammal that has ever drawn breath, and that ruled an entire continent for 2 million years, until in the span of a few thousand it was reduced to marks on bone and a faded shape on a rock wall. The marsupial lion did not lose because it was weak. It was, by almost every measure, one of the most perfectly engineered predators the world has ever produced. It lost because the world it was built to rule disappeared beneath it, faster than 2 million years of refinement could ever adapt to. The most specialized predator on the continent had become a prisoner of its own perfection, too large, too dependent on giant prey, too finely tuned to a vanishing world to bend in time. But Thylacoleo was not the only monster stalking Pleistocene Australia, and it may not even have been the one it feared most. Out on the same ground, hunting the giants, moved a reptile that grew longer than a car, a monitor lizard scaled up to a size that has no living equal, an ambush predator that may have been venomous, and that could have challenged the marsupial lion for the title of apex of the continent. The Aboriginal people who arrived in Australia would have had to share the land with it too. They called the marsupial lion's rival nothing, because we will never know its name. We call it megalania, and what it was capable of is, if anything, harder to believe than what you have just heard.